All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, we are talking about December 14th, 2012. That was the date that a gunman entered Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut, and using a Remington Bushmaster rifle, killed 20 children and 6 staff members. This is the 10th anniversary of Sandy Hook. There will surely be a lot of coverage out there from many, many angles. Gun violence, school safety, mental health, the political response. I'll be honest, we were a little wary of diving into this. It's just such a tough conversation, but we decided we wanted to do it and talk about Sandy Hook, in particular because we have with us an expert on right-wing media, and that is a big part of this story. All the conspiracy theories that popped up in the wake of the tragedy, of course, the worst of which were promulgated by people like Alex Jones. And here we are, 10 years later, when juries in Texas and Connecticut awarded $1.4 billion in damages to the families of Sandy Hook as a result of Jones's lies and defamation about the incident. And Jones has declared for personal bankruptcy. So, we're going to start with that. That's our angle. The conspiracy theories about Sandy Hook, what they teach us about the right-wing media ecosystem, and the politics, because there's this question of how the GOP has danced with people like Alex Jones, particularly over the last 10 years or so. So, here to discuss, as always, are Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Incredibly, deeply sad story. Just really tough to even, with our particular angle, to start to dive in. But
I will say, I spent the last 3 years talking to members of the Obama administration, and this is one of those areas where if you just mention Sandy Hook, people immediately start crying because of the memories and the trauma of that day. So I do think it is one of those days that left such an enormous scar on so many people, of course, the people who are involved, but so many Americans. And that, I think, is why it's worth talking about Alex Jones's role in this, because to take that moment of trauma and to make it that much worse is a pretty unforgivable thing.
Yeah, I remember Barack Obama talking about this being the worst day of his presidency, certainly the worst day in the lives of those parents and those who attended the school. I don't also think we could have imagined that this would be the first among many. Yeah. I think we all thought that something like a shooting of children is unprecedented and almost impossible. And I think the sadness is that we've seen this again and again and again in countless ways going forward.
Well, this is a bit of a, at this point, something that's been said a lot about Sandy Hook, but that line about, when we saw that this wasn't going to get people to act, then, it makes you realize, what will. And is that something the Obama administration folks you talked to, Niki, reflected?
Yeah, they were certain they were going to be able to do something because public sentiment was so strong. Like people weren't just outraged. People were bereft. It was something that was inconceivable.
Grief-stricken.
And so there was a real sense that this is the moment that change is going to happen. And that actually, for what it's worth, is part of the story of Alex Jones and Sandy Hook. The conspiracies that he spreads about Sandy Hook are about the government being involved, the government staging this as a false flag operation in order to come for your guns. And so he immediately, just almost instantly, puts his finger on this sore spot or this activation button for far right and right wing activists, which is the government is coming for your guns. And he uses Sandy Hook conspiracy theories to convince them that that's what's happening.
The crazy thing about this is that it didn't take a whole lot of time to marinate.
No.
Like, this is almost immediate. Like, I feel like you got 9/11 into their conspiracy theories, but I felt like a lot of that came out after there had been a little bit of distance or time. But this was like, oh, this is immediately, hearsay. We don't know the facts, and it just became so cloudy so quickly that I don't know what's more mind-boggling to me, the conspiracy itself or the swiftness with which it took hold, and people were peddling out these ideas within days and weeks of the shooting.
Hours. I mean,
Hours.
I think, and Niki, I'm curious, I mentioned you're our aforementioned right-wing media watcher, but there's reporting that, just in the afternoon of the shooting, Alex Jones is on the message boards built around his show saying, we're starting to see telltale signs that this might be staged. I'm watching it. I'll let you know. And then, there's this tidbit about the police chief in Newtown, the press conference that day saying, like, I'm getting all these emails. I'm getting these strange emails. People are reaching out. So, it's starting so quickly. And obviously the internet is helping fuel that speed. But Niki, can you sort of paint how Jones himself and that world are primed to react to this? Have there been incidents in the past where they have felt that specifically like mass violence with guns were false flags? Or was it more like we have this larger distrust of anything and then it quickly materializes into a specific theory about this specific incident?
So Jones has been on the false flag beat at this point for more than 15 years. The Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, he argued that it was done by the government. 9/11, he was a 9/11 truther as well. In fact, his go-to response for any major terror attack or major incident of violence in the U.S. was to suggest that the government was behind it. Now, he's somebody who came up in conspiracy media. I mean, he came up in a household where the John Birch Society, which we've talked about before on this show, the conspiracy society on the right that was founded back in the late 1950s, pamphlets of conspiracy literature were part of what he read growing up. So he was used to thinking of the government as the enemy, and this idea that there were these bigger national level, but also worldwide conspiracies, whether those were, the one world order, whether it was the Jews, he kind of runs the gamut. He's also like super into the idea that demons do things and extraterrestrials do things. So he's got them all. He's collected all the conspiracy theories. And so his audiences are ready for that.
And in a case like this, this question of this is a false flag to then create a premise under which they will come for your guns or go after the Second Amendment or whatever. Is that a concern specifically of Alex Jones? Like, I can't tell how much is this, what the mix is here of quote unquote gun rights concerns and how much is it just like paranoia conspiracy about anything and then looking for, a sinister government explanation for anything.
Well, so a couple of things. One, the government coming for your guns is something that Jones has also talked about since the early 1990s around Ruby Ridge and around Waco. This idea that the government was ready to come in armed, regiments to come take your guns. So that has been a through line throughout. And that is not just limited to Jones. That is something that is very common on the right. When Barack Obama was elected in 2008, gun sales spiked, as did militia memberships, because people were so convinced that Obama was going to take their guns. And that is not just Alex Jones listeners. That said, I think it's also, because it is such a trigger, it is something that Jones goes to because the point of his show, in addition to spreading conspiracies, is to sell stuff. And if you get people nice and scared, and if you get people to really pay attention to what you're saying because they're scared, you can move more product. And one of the things that came out in the Jones investigations and the trials and the depositions was that traffic spiked at InfoWars when they started floating these Sandy Hook conspiracies, and that's why they go back to that well again and again.
I'm just baffled at how 1 year after Sandy Hook, they did a poll and like 1 in 4 Americans believed that this might be a hoax. And I guess I've always sort of, relegated some of these people as fanatics or the extreme. Clearly, most people don't believe this. It's only a small percentage of people that do. But when you start to see how much traction he has about just creating doubt, right? Maybe you don't believe it, but there's a possibility. Even that sort of line of thinking is so dangerous. And yet it's spread like wildfire. And we saw day after day or night after night news coverage of people talking with these families, of these families going before Congress to testify, and none of that seemed convincing. And I guess for me, I'm always like, it's hard for one person to keep up a lie, but for like dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of people to maintain a lie consistently seems pretty hard. It seems pretty hard to do.
Although, the U.S. has been awash in conspiracies, frankly, since the founding. So it's not a new story of new technology or new changes in politics. Although, obviously, these conspiracies spread much more quickly. And in this case, conspiracy theories, as we were talking about, around Oklahoma City, around 9/11, they're all out there. But in this case, Jones specifically named parents and said that they were actors and that the children were crisis actors. And that's where he crosses the line over into defamation. And also by returning to the topic again and again, it encouraged his listeners to then harass those parents, many of whom have had to move several times or go into hiding. And so that's what makes this different from like a 9/11 conspiracy.
And which I suppose is a bit of a product of modern technology in that, these activated listeners were able to track down these parents and get at them and find out information about them and harass them and so forth. And I suppose there's some version of an Alex Jones watcher that's like sees it as a circus and is just sort of a little bit at arm's removed. But it's still, as you've both been pointing out, it still infects you in some way, even if it's just the whole just asking questions thing. And then obviously this goes to the next step, and he activates his listeners and his audience, and then they take this action and they harass families, as we've been describing.
It also sets a precedent because afterwards, every shooting that comes afterwards also gets called into question. And so a lot of these Sandy Hook parents are telling the parents of other victims, hey, get ready, you're about to be debunked in like 3, 2, 1.
Yeah. And that actually brings us back a little to the timetable here, because I think it's worth revisiting. I think the trial has been in the news. We understand the basic contours, but we talked about how some of the rumors started immediately, and Jones is in that sort of just asking questions, this let's see what this is mode, the day of. The next January, there's this really fascinating quote from him, a few months, a month or so later. But he says, in the last month and a half, I have not come out and said that this was clearly a staged event. And then it's like, Alex Jones, stop talking now. But then he goes on and says, unfortunately, evidence is beginning to come out that points more and more in that direction. So, I don't know, for whatever reason, it feels important to me to point out that Jones himself sort of marks an evolution towards conspiracy, towards more disinformation. It's not, I have this conspiracy theory, and then as I learn more, I become less convinced. And I think that tracks with so much. Frankly, I think that a lot of us say, it's just a matter of information. As time goes on, as more information comes out, people will unconvince themselves of something because the truth is the truth. And I think this is evidence that it can work in exactly the opposite direction.
And it's worth noting that that's a rhetorical trick that Jones is using. He is telling his audience that he has been down this intellectual fact-based journey, that he has been doing research, and he has now become convinced that this is what happened. That's not true, but it is part of leaning on kind of the trappings of the Enlightenment and logic and the scientific theory and all of these things to sort of play act at rationalism in order to spread
research.
irrational conspiracy theories, right? And this is something you see again and again. You see it in QAnon, right? QAnon people are not uninformed people. They're people who often take in just massive amounts of information, but they read it through this conspiracy lens, and they end up with a very warped worldview at the end of it.
And so it is that stretch, January, February, March, April, May of 2013. In April 13, he straight up says Sandy Hook was a government operation with inside job written all over it, and talks about crisis actors and it being a hoax and so forth. And, I think that if we cut now to the trial that has been going on over the last couple years and just wrapped up, there were moments where he characterized even that stretch of time in early 2013. He seemed to characterize it himself as I was in a sort of period of mania. And I was 100% believed it, but now I recognize that I was under the thrall of it. Watching that trial, Niki, what did you see in Jones in terms of this really fundamental and vexing question of how much is he a true believer and how much is he doing this for show or for money?
Jones is not a reliable narrator of his own actions or his own experiences or his own thoughts. So I wouldn't take anything he said at the trial as a reflection of how he actually experienced this around Sandy Hook. The truth about Jones is that he doesn't care. He doesn't care if it's real or not. He cares about making money off of it, and he cares about not losing these trials. But he doesn't care. Like, he's asked during his depositions to name the children who were killed at Sandy Hook, and he's not able to do it, or he at least refuses to do it. And so, trying to figure out his true beliefs. He certainly is somebody who has been in a conspiratorial world for a very long time. He's somebody who seems to very truly believe in demons and a variety of other things that he doesn't talk about as much when he's looking for respectability. But when it comes to Sandy Hook, I think the most important thing is that it does not matter to him what the truth is.
Yeah. And also very, passive language, like, oh, it's unfortunate that these events led to, like, it's never a whole lot of ownership about mistakes. Even the idea of, like, mistakes were made. It's a very passive way of sort of, like, not addressing what is the cause of the issue. So, I don't know. I'm when I think about this whole thing, I'm still trying to figure out, like, what is more grievous. I mean, obviously the loss of these children is, as a parent, you're, like, inconsolable. But I cannot imagine having to navigate that grief through, like, a public denial. Like, not even, like, dismissal, just denial. Like, it's just unimaginable to me.
Yeah, I think it just turns into a combination of rage and a kind of obsessive need, understandably obsessive need, to prove that your child existed and your child died and that your grief is real. And it's part of the reason why the parents were able to pursue these lawsuits over such a long amount of time.
I'm glad that they pursued it, but I hate that they had to.
Yeah. And, I think it shows how in his own bubble and in his own head and in his own ego, Alex Jones is, that he never really was confronted until the trial with these questions, and then even then didn't really have to think about it and didn't care to think about it. That said, and as we wrap up here, let's turn to the other element here, the political element. There are people who should have thought about it and should know better and were still sort of in Alex Jones's orbit in many ways politicians, and in many ways that involves a lot of sort of notable members of the GOP. And so I'm curious kind of we can paint a picture of what Jones's relationship has been with the quote unquote mainstream GOP in these last 10 years. And, if you want to provide a little backstory then as well, but did this change anything in terms of the dance that people were playing with Alex Jones from politicians in the 80s and 90s and of course going into Trump and to today?
Yeah, Jones was a fringe figure. He wasn't somebody who necessarily was seen as a person connected with either major political party, precisely because he trafficked in such obscene conspiracy theories. That changes in 2015 when Donald Trump, himself a conspiracy theorist, runs for president. And people within Trump's orbit, people like Steve Bannon, people like Roger Stone, connect Donald Trump to Alex Jones, they say, here's somebody that you have to talk to. You can win over his audience. Trump does that. And Jones basically rides off of that for the next, 7 years. Roger Stone will have a show on InfoWars off and on during the Trump administration. Nick Fuentes, a white supremacist / neo-Nazi, has a show on Alex Jones's band.video. And then it's like all of these people are sort of connected to people like Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene. Marjorie Taylor Greene goes on the show a number of times. And so he's no longer persona non grata in this way that he had been before. And increasingly, you see an evolution among people like Tucker Carlson, who releases this, I guess we can call it a political documentary called Patriot Purge after January 6th that talks about it as a false flag event where agents provocateur were the ones who were actually causing the insurrection at the Capitol. And it sounds just like InfoWars. So it's not just the connection with politicians, but it's moving the Overton window sharply in Jones's direction.
Oh, it's legitimacy. Yeah. Like it's a stamp of approval. Like when you can have people that will lend their own, I can't even say credibility, but credence, I guess, to, this platform, even if they're not talking about Sandy Hook, the very fact that they could partner or engage with Jones is, in my opinion, abhorrent.
Right. Just to state the obvious, right? All the things you just described are happening since the Sandy Hook stuff, right? And it's like, and so at some basic level, this is a story of, not even, there was not accountability, but there was actually, the GOP moved closer to Alex Jones in the wake of all the stuff that we were just describing.
Because they didn't care either.
Right. Because they didn't care either, or they saw some political expediency, which is a form of not caring.
Same thing.
Sure. Same thing. Yeah. As we wrap up, though, I do wonder, like, this judgment and Alex Jones's, having to file for personal bankruptcy. There is a story there in some sense of some sort of justice, in whatever way you want to describe it. And it makes me also think again of also like the arc that January 6th is taking and election denial is taking. And, as terrified as I am about the sort of what those storylines tell us, I also see, this last election in some way as a rebuke of some of that stuff and a sort of defense of Americans standing up for democracy and so forth. And so, how do we, let's just keep it on Sandy Hook, but how do we see this trial as a kind of like blip or a narrative arc or what in terms of, what people like Jones can get away with?
Consequences matter. And we saw this even before the lawsuits were concluded, but Jones was deplatformed and demonetized in places like YouTube and Twitter, which didn't eliminate his reach, but helped to limit it in some ways. And these judgments, he's filed corporate bankruptcy, he's filed personal bankruptcy. He has like so many shell companies that it will be very, very difficult to actually take that money away from him and give it to the families. But it is going to have serious consequences for the ability of InfoWars to continue to make money. And, we'll have to wait and see what happens, but it is certainly a step in the right direction.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll leave it there. Again, we're really trying to figure out how to navigate this conversation. I know there's 10th anniversary. There's going to be 10 years since this awful event. There will be a lot of conversations out there, but I'm really glad we were able to get together and have this one. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.